The first light of dawn painted the rocky shores of Ithaca in shades of gold and amber, as Odysseus stood at the edge of his beloved island kingdom, surveying the fleet of black ships that would carry him away from everything he held dear. The wooden vessels bobbed gently in the harbor, their dark hulls gleaming with fresh tar and their bronze-tipped rams catching the early morning sunlight like deadly smiles. Each ship bore the carved image of a dolphin at its prow, the sacred symbol of his house and reminder of the sea that both blessed and cursed his island realm. Behind him the palace of Ithaca rose from the hillside, its white marble columns standing like silent sentinels against the deep blue sky. From the royal quarters came the soft sound of weeping, where his wife Penelope held their infant son Telemachus close to her breast, knowing that this day would change their lives forever. The baby gurgled innocently in his mother's arms, unaware that his father was about to embark on a journey that would separate them for 20 long years. Odysseus ran his weathered hands through his dark beard, feeling the weight of kingship and responsibility pressing down upon his broad shoulders. At 30 years old, he was already renowned throughout the Greek islands as a master of strategy and cunning, but this morning he felt like nothing more than a husband and father reluctant to leave his family. The messenger from King Menelaus of Sparta had arrived 3 days ago with news that would echo through the halls of history. Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, had been stolen away by Paris, Prince of Troy, and all the kings of Greece were bound by sacred oath to help bring her home. The bronze gates of the palace opened with a deep groan, and Penelope emerged wrapped in a cloak of deep purple that marked her royal station. Her dark eyes were red from weeping, but her chin was raised with the dignity befitting a queen of Ithaca. She carried little Telemachus in her arms, the child reaching out with tiny fingers toward his father, as if sensing the approaching separation. In her other hand, she held a leather pouch containing sacred herbs and a lock of her own hair, traditional gifts to protect a warrior on his journey to foreign lands. My beloved husband, she whispered as she approached, must you truly sail with this fleet of war? The gods have blessed us with peace on our island, and our people prosper under your wise rule. Why should we concern ourselves with the troubles of distant Troy? Her voice carried the musical quality that had first captured his heart when they were both young and the world seemed full of endless possibilities. Odysseus took his wife in his strong arms, feeling the familiar warmth of her body against his chest and breathing in the sweet scent of olive oil and lavender that always clung to her dark hair. My dearest Penelope, you know as well as I that honor binds me to this cause. When Helen was sought by all the princes, though of Greece I was among those who swore the sacred oath to protect whichever man she chose as husband. Now that Paris has violated the laws of hospitality and stolen her away from Menelaus, all who swore that oath must answer the call to war, the eye. Queen of Ithaca pulled back slightly to look into her husband's grey eyes, those keen orbs that could see through any deception or read the intentions of men like words written on parchment. But you are needed here, my lord. The people look to you for guidance and protection. What if enemies come while you are gone? What if pirates raid our shores or neighboring kingdoms seek to expand their borders into our territory? She gestured toward the harbor where fishermen were already launching their small boats to begin their daily work. These simple folk depend on your strength and wisdom. That is why I leave you as regent in my absence. Odysseus replied gently, placing his calloused hand against her smooth cheek. Your intelligence matches my own, and your understanding of our people's needs surpasses even mine. You have the blood of kings in your veins, and the gods have blessed you with both beauty and wisdom. The council of elders will advise you, but the final decisions will be yours to make. I trust no one more than you to guard our kingdom until my return. Young Telemachus began to fuss in his mother's arms, and Odysseus took the baby with the careful movements of a man who had learned to handle both sword and infant with equal skill. The child immediately calmed at his father's touch, tiny fingers grasping at the bronze clasps of his leather armor, as if trying to keep him from leaving. My son, the king whispered, you are too young to understand, but someday you will learn that a man must sometimes leave those he loves most in order to protect them. When you are grown, you will know that honor and duty are not burdens, but the very foundations upon which a good life is built. From the harbour came the sound of his captains calling orders to their crews and the splash of oars being tested in the calm water. The time for departure was drawing near, and already the other ships in the fleet were beginning to form up in sailing formation. Odysseus could see the distinctive red sails of King Diomedes's vessels and the golden prow ornaments that marked the ships of noble Ajax. The greatest warriors of Greece were gathering for what would become the most famous siege in all of history. "Promise me," Penelope said, suddenly gripping his arm with surprising strength. "Promise me that you will not let glory and adventure cloud your judgment. Remember that you have a home and family waiting for you here. Do not let the songs of bards and the praise of other heroes make you forget the path back to Ithaca." Her words carried a strange prophetic weight, as if she could see through the veil of time to the trials that awaited him. "I swear by Zeus himself and by the sacred olive tree that grows in our bedroom that I will return to you," Odysseus replied solemnly. "No matter what obstacles the gods place in my path, no matter what temptations or dangers I may face, I will find my way home to you and our son. This I promise with my life, and honor as witness." The royal couple walked slowly toward the harbour, followed by the household servants and palace guards who had come to see their king depart. The people of Ithaca lined the stone streets, tossing flower petals and calling out, "Blessings for a safe journey and swift victory." Old women burned sweet incense at small shrines, while children waved olive branches, the symbol of peace that they hoped would soon return to their island at the water's edge. Odysseus embraced his most trusted advisors and gave final instructions for the governance of his kingdom. In his absence, his steward Medon would oversee the palace staff and ensure that tribute continued to flow in from the outlying settlements. His master of arms, Heartfelt, would train the young men who were too inexperienced for this campaign, so that Ithaca would have defenders if needed. The wise old counselor mentor would serve as Penelope's chief advisor and help guide her through any difficult decisions. My Lord called Euryclea, the ancient nurse who had cared for Odysseus since infancy. "I have prepared your favorite foods for the journey and packed your finest robes for when you meet with the other kings. Remember to eat well and keep warm on those cold sea nights. The old bones tell me this will be a longer voyage than any of you expect." The king smiled at the woman who had been like a mother to him since his own mother's death years before. "Dear nurse, your warnings are always worth heeding. I will take care to follow your advice, though I suspect the fighting at Troy will end before the first winter sets in. The walls of that city may be strong, but they have never faced the combined might of all Greece." As he prepared to board his flagship, Odysseus took one last look at his kingdom from the harbour. The olive groves stretched up the hillsides in neat rows, their silver-green leaves shimmering in the morning breeze. The vineyards showed the first purple hint of ripening grapes, and the wheat fields beyond the town walls swayed like a golden sea under the gentle wind. It was a sight of such perfect peace and prosperity that it seemed impossible anything could ever disturb this blessed land. His crew of 50 men stood ready, at their posts, each one handpicked for this expedition. They were not just sailors but warriors who had proven themselves in previous campaigns against pirates and raiders. Their bronze armor gleamed, and their shields bore the dolphin emblem of Ithaca with pride. These men would follow him to the ends of the earth if necessary, and he knew that their loyalty would be tested before this journey reached its end. The captain of his flagship approached with the ritual cup of wine mixed with honey that would serve as a libation to Poseidon, lord of the sea. "The wind is favorable, my king, and the other ships are ready to depart. The sooner we leave, the sooner we can finish this business and return home to our families." Odysseus took the cup and poured half its contents into the harbour, while speaking the ancient prayer for safe passage. "Great Poseidon, earth-shaker and master of the wine-dark sea, grant us swift sailing to Troy, and swifter sailing home when our work is done. Protect us from storms and sea monsters, and guide us safely through all the perils of your vast domain." The remaining wine he drank in a single draught, feeling its warmth spread through his chest, like liquid courage, with a final kiss for Penelope and gentle touch to his son's soft cheek. Odysseus boarded his ship and took his place at the steering oar. The crew began their rowing chant, and the black vessel moved slowly away from the dock. The other ships of his small fleet fell into formation. Behind him, 12 vessels in total, carrying 600 of Ithaca's finest warriors toward their destiny at Troy. As the island of his birth grew smaller behind them, Odysseus felt a strange chill despite the warmth of the morning sun. A seabird cried overhead, and for a moment its call sounded almost like a warning from the gods themselves. He shook off the feeling and focused on the horizon ahead, where adventure and glory awaited. But deep in his heart he carried the image of Penelope standing on the shore with their child, and the promise that had passed between them, like a sacred bond. 10 years had passed since the black ships first appeared on the horizon beyond the beaches of Troy, and the great city still stood defiant behind its massive walls that seemed to scrape the very belly of the sky. The siege had dragged on through countless seasons of war, transforming young warriors into grizzled veterans and reducing the flower of Greek nobility to sun-darkened men with hollow eyes and hearts heavy with the weight of so much death. Odysseus stood on a low hill overlooking the Trojan plain, where the wind carried the scent of smoke from funeral pyres that burned day and night, consuming the bodies of heroes whose names would echo through eternity. His own appearance had changed dramatically from the proud young king who had sailed from Ithaca. With such high hopes and noble intentions, his dark hair now showed streaks of premature silver, and his face bore the deep lines carved by years of sleepless nights, spent planning strategies and mourning fallen comrades. The bronze armor that had gleamed so brightly on that first morning now bore countless dents and scratches, each one a testament to battles fought and enemies vanquished. His grey eyes had grown harder and more calculating as he learned that survival in this endless war required not just courage, but cunning beyond anything he had previously imagined. Below him, the Greek camp stretched along the shore like a city of tents and makeshift shelters, where 50,000 warriors lived in conditions that would have shamed the poorest peasant back in their homeland. The great heroes of legend had been reduced to sleeping on hard ground and eating whatever provisions the supply ships could bring from across the wine-dark sea. Mighty Achilles brooded in his tent, nursing his wounded pride, while Ajax, the giant son of Telamon, practiced his sword work with the mechanical precision of a man who no longer remembered what peace felt like. The walls of Troy loomed before them, as impregnable as the day they first arrived, built by the gods themselves, according to legend, and defended by warriors whose bravery matched even the greatest champions of Greece. Prince Hector, son of King Priam, had proven himself the equal of any Greek hero leading sorties from the gates that left dozens of their best men dead on the blood-soaked plain. His younger brother Paris, the cause of all this suffering, remained safely behind the walls, while better men died for his crime of stealing Helen from her rightful husband. Odysseus had tried every strategy his clever mind could devise, from direct assault to siege engines to attempts at infiltrating the city through bribery or deception, but the Trojans had proven remarkably resourceful in their defense. The city was well supplied with food and water from sources within the walls, and their allies continued to send reinforcements from across Asia Minor, keeping their numbers strong despite the constant pressure from the Greek forces. Every plan had failed. Every scheme had been countered, and the war had settled into a grinding stalemate that was slowly destroying both sides. The other Greek kings had grown restless and bitter as the years dragged on without decisive victory. Many spoke openly of abandoning the siege and returning to their own kingdoms, where crops failed and enemies gathered strength while their armies remained trapped before the walls of Troy. Agamemnon, the High King and brother of the wronged Menelaus, had managed to hold the coalition together through a mixture of threats, promises, and appeals to honor. But even his authority was beginning to crack under the strain of so many failed campaigns. It was during the darkest hour of the 10th year, when hope seemed as distant as the peaks of Mount Ida, that Odysseus conceived the plan that would finally break the deadlock and bring the mighty city to its knees. The idea came to him in a dream, sent perhaps by Athena, the grey-eyed goddess who had always favored him with her wisdom. He saw himself standing before the walls of Troy, not as a conqueror, but as a gift-bearer, offering the Trojans something so magnificent that they would welcome it into their city. Despite every instinct of caution, when he awakened, Before dawn in his simple tent, Odysseus knew that he had found the key to victory, but the plan would require all of his persuasive powers to convince the other Greek leaders to attempt something so audacious and seemingly impossible. He spent the morning hours refining the details in his mind, working out every aspect of the deception that would either win them the war or destroy them all in a catastrophic failure that would make their 10 years of sacrifice meaningless. The assembly of kings gathered in Agamemnon's great tent, as they had done countless times before, but this meeting would prove different from all the others, as Odysseus rose to address his fellow commanders with a proposal that would test their courage and their faith in his legendary cunning. The tent fell silent as he began to speak, his voice carrying the authority earned through years of proven leadership and successful strategies. Great kings and noble heroes, we have spent 10 years attempting to breach walls that the gods themselves built, and our efforts have been valiant but ultimately futile. We have lost too many good men in frontal assaults and siege attempts that were doomed from the start. The time has come to admit that strength alone will never open the gates of Troy, but perhaps deception can accomplish what force has failed to achieve. Agamemnon leaned forward on his throne, his weathered face creased with skepticism, born of too many disappointed hopes. What scheme do you propose now, Odysseus? We have tried every trick you could devise, from night raids to attempts at corrupting their guards. What new plan could possibly succeed where all others have failed? We will build them a gift, Odysseus replied, with a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. A horse so magnificent and so obviously sacred to the gods that the Trojans will compete with each other for the honor of dragging it through their gates. We will make it appear that we have abandoned the siege in despair and sailed away, leaving behind this final offering to ensure safe passage home. The other kings exchanged puzzled glances, and Diomedes, the fierce warrior son of Tydeus, shook his head in disbelief. A wooden horse? How could such a thing possibly help us take the city? Are you suggesting we somehow use it as a siege engine or a platform for archers? The Trojans are not fools. Odysseus, they will examine any gift we leave behind with the greatest suspicion. Not a siege engine, but a hiding place. Odysseus explained, his eyes gleaming with the intensity of inspiration. We will build it large enough to conceal 30 of our best warriors inside its hollow belly, while the rest of our forces sail away to hide behind the island of Tenedos. The Trojans will find the horse on the beach along with a single Greek prisoner who will tell them that it is a sacred offering to Athena, built to ensure our safe passage home and too sacred to be destroyed. King Menelaus, whose stolen wife had caused all their suffering, stood up abruptly. His face flushed with anger. You propose that we retreat from Troy after 10 years of war. Are you suggesting that we simply give up our quest for justice and sail home in shame, while Paris keeps my Helen as his prize? Not retreat, but the most daring advance in the history of warfare. Odysseus countered calmly. When the Trojans drag our gift inside their walls, thinking themselves finally victorious, our hidden warriors will emerge in the darkness to open the gates from within. The rest of our forces will return under cover of night, and the city that has defied us for 10 years will fall before dawn. The tent erupted in heated discussion as the kings debated the merits and dangers of such an unprecedented strategy. Some argued that it was the desperate scheme of a man driven mad by years of fruitless warfare, while others began to see the brilliant simplicity of using the Trojans' own victory celebration against them. Ajax, son of Oileus, pointed out that if the plan failed, those hidden inside the horse would face certain death, while Nestor, the aged king of Pylos, praised the cunning that might finally end their long ordeal. For 3 days, the debate continued as Odysseus patiently answered every objection and refined every detail of his audacious plan. He selected the 30 warriors who would hide inside the wooden construction, choosing men known for their ability to remain silent and motionless for hours at a time. The master shipwright, Epeius, was summoned from the fleet to begin construction of the massive hollow horse that would serve as both offering and instrument of deception. The building of the Trojan horse became a project that consumed the entire Greek camp, as warriors, who had spent 10 years trying to tear down walls, now labored to create the greatest work of craftsmanship in the history of warfare. The wooden beast took shape over several weeks, standing 3 stories tall with intricate carvings that made it appear to be a gift worthy of the gods themselves. Hidden panels in its belly would allow the concealed warriors to see out, while remaining completely invisible from the outside. When the great work was finally complete, Odysseus himself led the selected warriors in a ceremony of purification and sacrifice to Athena, asking the goddess to bless their desperate gamble with success. The men chosen for the mission included the greatest heroes of Greece, from mighty Ajax to clever Diomedes, each one knowing that they were volunteering for what might well prove to be a suicide mission. If the Trojans discovered the deception as night fell on what they all hoped would be the final evening of the siege, the 30 chosen warriors climbed through the hidden entrance into the belly of the wooden horse, where they would remain motionless and silent until the moment came to emerge and open the gates of Troy. The rest of the Greek fleet began to sail away in the darkness, leaving behind only the mysterious gift and sign on a Greek warrior who volunteered to pose as a deserter and sell the story of the horse to the unsuspecting Trojans inside the cramped darkness of their wooden prison. Odysseus and his companions began the longest wait of their lives, listening to the sounds of Troy awakening to find the Greek camp apparently abandoned, and wondering if their incredible gamble would succeed or if they had simply trapped themselves in an elaborate tomb. The fate of 10 years of war now hung on the success of a deception so audacious that future generations would struggle to believe it had actually been attempted. The burning towers of Troy had long since disappeared beneath the horizon when Odysseus stood at the prow of his flagship, watching the darkening sky with growing unease as storm clouds gathered, like an army of angry gods preparing for battle. The victorious Greek fleet had scattered after the fall of the great city, each king eager to return to his own kingdom with his share of Trojan treasure. But the 12 ships under Odysseus' command now found themselves alone on the wine-dark sea, facing winds that seemed determined to drive them far from their intended course toward home. 3 days had passed since they sailed from the Trojan shores laden with gold and precious goods that represented their reward for 10 years of warfare. But the weather had turned against them with a fury that suggested divine displeasure. The waves grew higher with each passing hour, and the wind howled through the rigging like the voices of the war-dead seeking vengeance. The experienced sailors among his crew exchanged worried glances as they struggled to keep their vessels on course, while Odysseus himself began to suspect that their troubles were only just beginning. His men were exhausted from the long siege and the brutal final assault on Troy that had left the city in flames and its people scattered to the winds. They had fought with the desperate courage of warriors who knew that failure meant death, but victory had brought its own burdens as they loaded their ships with treasures that would make them rich beyond their wildest dreams, yet somehow felt tainted with the blood of innocent civilians who had died when the city fell. The storm struck without warning as the sun disappeared behind a wall of black clouds that seemed to rise from the depths of the ocean itself. Lightning split the sky in brilliant forks that illuminated mountainous waves tall enough to swallow entire ships, while thunder crashed overhead like the hammer blows of Hephaestus forging weapons for the gods. The carefully maintained formation of 12 vessels was scattered like leaves in a hurricane, as each captain fought desperately to keep his ship afloat in seas that seemed intent on claiming them. All Odysseus gripped the steering oar with hands that had grown white from the strain of fighting against currents that pulled his ship in directions he had never intended to sail. His crew worked frantically to secure loose cargo and bail out the water that crashed over their sides with every massive wave. But despite their best efforts, they were being driven steadily away from the familiar waters near Greece toward regions of the sea that appeared on no maps and were spoken of only in the whispered tales of frightened sailors. For 9 days, the storm raged without mercy, driving the 12 ships of Ithaca through waters that grew stranger and more ominous with each passing hour. The sun, when it could be glimpsed through the racing clouds, seemed to follow an unfamiliar path across the sky, and the stars at night appeared in configurations that no Greek navigator had ever recorded. The air itself tasted different, carrying scents of unknown spices and flowers that suggested they were approaching lands that existed far beyond the boundaries of the civilized world, when the storm finally exhausted its fury and the seas began to calm. Odysseus found himself staring at an island that sparkled in the morning sunlight like a jewel set in azure waters. The shoreline was fringed with beaches of white sand that seemed to glow with an inner light, while beyond the strand rose hills covered with vegetation so lush and green that it appeared almost supernatural in its abundance. Fruit trees heavy with ripe offerings lined the coast, and streams of clear water could be seen cascading down from the interior highlands toward the welcoming sea. The exhausted crews of all 12 ships turned their weary eyes toward this paradise that seemed to offer everything they needed for rest and recovery after their ordeal in the supernatural storm. Fresh water for their depleted barrels, fruit to supplement their dwindling provisions, and solid ground where they could stretch their cramped limbs and repair the damage that wind and wave had inflicted on their vessels. The island appeared completely uninhabited and peaceful, as if it had been placed there by benevolent gods, specifically to aid weary travelers as they approached the mysterious shore. Odysseus felt a strange sense of unease, despite the apparent safety and abundance that lay before them. His instincts had been sharpened by 10 years of warfare and countless encounters with deception and treachery, but he could detect no obvious danger in the tranquil scene that greeted their arrival. The beaches were empty of any human presence, and no smoke rose from cooking fires that might indicate the existence of hostile inhabitants ready to defend their territory. The ships ran their prows up onto the soft sand with a gentle grinding sound that seemed almost musical after the harsh roar of the storm waves, and the crews began to disembark with the careful movements of men who had learned to be cautious even when approaching what appeared to be salvation. The first priority was fresh water, and several of the younger warriors immediately set off toward the nearest stream with empty amphora, while others began gathering driftwood for cooking fires. It was then that the inhabitants of the strange island made their appearance, emerging from groves of flowering trees like figures from a pleasant dream. They were clearly human in form, but possessed a quality of ethereal beauty and serenity that marked them as different from any people the Greeks had previously encountered. Their skin was golden brown from the warm sun, and their eyes held a depth of contentment that spoke of lives lived without conflict or sorrow. They moved with the unhurried grace of those who had never known fear or anger, and their voices, when they spoke, carried the musical quality of wind chimes stirring in a gentle breeze. The leader of these peaceful people approached Odysseus with a welcoming smile that seemed to radiate warmth and friendship, like sunlight breaking through morning clouds. He was a man of middle years with silver streaking his dark hair and wearing robes of white linen that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. His hands were empty of weapons, and his manner suggested nothing more threatening than a desire to offer hospitality to unexpected guests who had arrived on his shores. "Welcome, strangers, to our blessed island," the man said in perfect Greek, though his accent carried undertones that suggested origins in lands far more ancient than any kingdom known to modern civilization. "I am Euphron, first among the Lotus Eaters and speaker for our peaceful community. We have watched your ships approach through the storm, and we rejoice that you have found safety in our harbor. Please accept our hospitality and rest your weary bodies while you recover from your trials at sea." The mention of Lotus Eaters caused Odysseus to stiffen with sudden wariness as he recalled half-forgotten tales told by old sailors in waterfront taverns about islands where unwary travelers discovered pleasures so intense that they lost all desire to return to their former lives. But the immediate needs of his exhausted crew seemed to outweigh such nebulous concerns, and he found himself accepting the offered hospitality with cautious gratitude while mentally preparing to maintain strict discipline among his men. The Lotus Eaters led the Greek warriors inland through groves of trees whose branches hung heavy with fruits unlike anything they had seen before. The air was thick with the scent of flowers that bloomed in impossible profusion, and the very grass beneath their feet seemed to pulse with vibrant life. The streams that crossed their path ran crystal clear and tasted sweeter than any water they had drunk since leaving their homeland, while birds of brilliant plumage sang melodies that seemed designed to soothe away all memories of conflict and Hardship. At the center of the island lay a settlement that appeared to have grown naturally from the landscape itself, rather than being built by human hands. The dwellings were constructed from living wood that had been shaped and guided rather than cut, while gardens bloomed between the structures in patterns that suggested both careful planning and organic spontaneity. The Lotus Eaters moved through this paradise with the unhurried contentment of people who had discovered perfect harmony between human desires and natural abundance. Tables had been prepared for the arriving guests laden with foods that seemed to represent the very essence of nourishment, without any of the coarseness or heaviness that characterized normal sustenance. The fruits glowed with inner light and released fragrances that made the mouth water, while bread appeared to have been baked from grains that grew only in the fields of the blessed Odysseus noticed that everything offered to his men contained traces of the lotus flower whose petals were worked into every dish as both seasoning and decoration. Several of his younger warriors began to eat with enthusiasm, born of genuine hunger after days of short rations during the storm, but Odysseus himself barely touched the offered delicacies, while keeping careful watch on his men for any signs of the supernatural effects that the lotus was rumored to produce. The Lotus Eaters encouraged their guests to try everything with gentle insistence. That seemed motivated by nothing more than a desire to share the bounty of their blessed existence. Within an hour, the transformation began to manifest itself in those crew members who had eaten most heartily of the lotus-enhanced foods. They began to smile with expressions of dreamy contentment, and their voices took on the same musical quality that characterized their hosts. The restless energy that had driven them through 10 years of warfare seemed to drain away, leaving them calm and peaceful but somehow diminished, as if essential aspects of their humanity were dissolving like salt in warm water. When Odysseus attempted to rally his men for the return journey to their ships, he discovered that those affected by the lotus had lost all interest in continuing their voyage home. They spoke of Ithaca and their families, as if recalling distant dreams that held no emotional significance, and expressed only a desire to remain forever on the island where every need was satisfied. Without effort or struggle, the lotus had stolen not just their memories, but their very capacity for longing and ambition. The king of Ithaca realized with growing horror that he was witnessing a form of death more complete than any sword could inflict, as his bravest warriors were transformed into contented shadows of their former selves, who would spend eternity in paradise, but would never again experience the fierce joy of genuine human achievement or the deep satisfaction of overcoming difficult challenges through courage and determination. The escape from the Lotus Eaters had left Odysseus and his crews shaken, but wiser as they sailed away from that deceptively peaceful island with 12 men bound to the masts of their ships, weeping like children for the paradise they were being forced to abandon. The king of Ithaca had learned that some dangers came disguised as blessings, and that the strongest chains were often forged from pleasure rather than pain. But the lessons of that strange encounter would soon prove insufficient preparation for the horrors that awaited them on their next landfall. 7 days of hard sailing brought them to another island that appeared entirely different from the Lotus Eaters' realm. This new land rose from the sea in jagged cliffs of black volcanic stone, while smoke drifted from its peaks, suggesting active fires burning in the mountains beyond. The coastline offered few safe harbors, but eventually they discovered a narrow inlet that provided shelter for their 12 ships, though the black sand beaches and twisted rock formations gave the place an ominous atmosphere that made even the bravest warriors nervous. Odysseus chose 12 of his most trusted companions for a reconnaissance mission to explore this forbidding landscape and determine whether it held any threats to their fleet. The rest of his men would remain with the ships ready to depart, at a moment's notice if danger presented itself. He selected warriors known for their courage and quick thinking, including young Eurylochus, who had proven himself during the siege of Troy, and old Perimedes, whose experience made him invaluable in unknown territory. The scouting party made their way inland, through a landscape that seemed designed by malevolent gods to inspire fear and unease. Twisted trees grew from cracks in the volcanic rock, while strange birds circled overhead, crying out in voices that sounded almost human. The very air seemed heavy with an oppressive quality that made breathing difficult and the ground beneath their feet felt warm as if fires burned just below the surface. As they climbed higher into the hills, following what appeared to be an ancient path worn smooth. By countless feet, the warriors began to notice signs of habitation that filled them with growing alarm. Massive footprints pressed deep into patches of soft earth suggested inhabitants of truly gigantic proportions, while scattered bones that were, clearly human in origin, told a story of previous visitors who had not survived their encounter with whatever dwelt in these mountains. The path led them to a cave entrance so large that their entire ship could have sailed through it with room to spare. The opening yawned like the mouth of some primordial beast, while darkness beyond swallowed their torchlight within a few paces. Strange odors drifted from the depths carrying scents of animals and something else that might have been rotting flesh. The warriors exchanged nervous glances, but Odysseus, driven by the same curiosity that had made him a master strategist during the Trojan War, insisted they investigate further. Inside the cave they discovered clear evidence that this was indeed a dwelling place. Though one built on a scale that dwarfed anything they had previously encountered, crude furniture carved from massive tree trunks filled the space, while tools and weapons of proportions that would require superhuman strength to wield lay scattered about. Stone bowls large enough to bathe a man contained remnants of meals that included recognizable fragments of human bone mixed with the remains of sheep and goats. "My lord," whispered Eurylochus, his voice barely audible in the oppressive atmosphere of the vast cavern, "we should leave this accursed place immediately. Whatever dwells here is clearly hostile, to our kind and powerful enough to crush us all without effort. The bones speak plainly of the fate that awaits any who linger in this monster's domain." But Odysseus found himself fascinated by the sheer scale of everything around them and driven by an intellectual curiosity about the nature of the creature that could live in such primitive yet impressive conditions. The strategist in him recognized that knowledge of their enemies' capabilities could prove valuable even if they chose to avoid direct confrontation. His men gathered around stone jars filled with milk and cheese that represented wealth beyond anything a normal shepherd could accumulate. The sound that announced the return of the cave's inhabitant began as a distant rumbling that might have been mistaken for an earthquake, but gradually resolved into footsteps of such massive proportions that each impact shook dust from the cavern ceiling. The warriors barely had time to hide behind the crude furniture before the entrance was blocked by a figure so enormous that it seemed to fill the entire opening like a moving mountain. Polyphemus. The Cyclops entered his domain, driving before him a flock of sheep and goats whose size matched that of their owner. Each animal was easily twice the dimensions of normal livestock, while their shepherd towered above them like a giant from the age of Titans. His single eye gleamed in the firelight he kindled with casual gestures, while his voice, when he spoke to his animals, carried the rumbling quality of distant thunder. The monster was clothed in roughly tanned hides that had been stitched together without any attempt at refinement, while his hair and beard grew wild and unkempt in a manner that suggested complete indifference to personal appearance. His massive hands ended in fingers thick as ship's masts, and his single eye held an intelligence that was clearly malevolent in its assessment of the world around him. This was no mere beast, but a thinking creature whose thoughts had been shaped by isolation and unlimited power over his domain. After securing his flock by rolling a boulder across the cave entrance that no human strength could hope to move, Polyphemus began the process of preparing his evening meal with movements that demonstrated the casual efficiency born of long practice. The Cyclops milked his animals with hands that could have crushed a man's skull like an eggshell, while humming tunelessly to himself in evident satisfaction with his simple existence. It was then that his single eye noticed signs of intrusion in his carefully ordered domain. Footprints too small to belong to any creature he knew marked the dust near his stores, while the scent of foreign humans hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. His massive head turned slowly as he searched the shadows for the source of these disturbances, and his lips pulled back to reveal teeth that could bite through bronze as easily as a man might chew bread. "Who dares enter the cave of Polyphemus, son of Poseidon?" The Cyclops roared in a voice that made the entire cavern ring like a struck bell. "Show yourselves, little thieves, before I crush every bone in your miserable bodies and feed your flesh to my sheep." No mortal may take what belongs to me without paying the price that all trespassers must pay. Odysseus realized that hiding was no longer possible and stepped forward with the confidence of a king addressing his subjects, though his heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. Great Polyphemus, we are travelers, blown far from our intended course by the anger of the storm god. We meant no offense by sheltering in your magnificent dwelling and would gladly offer payment for any inconvenience we may have caused. The Cyclops stared down at the tiny figure who dared speak to him with such boldness, and his laugh shook loose stones from the ceiling. Payment, you say? What payment could insects like you possibly offer to one whose father rules all the seas? The only payment I require is the satisfaction of hearing your bones crack between my teeth. Without further warning, his massive hand shot out and seized two of the hidden warriors, dragging them screaming into the firelight. What followed was too horrible for the surviving men to remember clearly in later years, as Polyphemus demonstrated the casual brutality that had made him the terror of these waters. The two warriors died quickly, but not mercifully, while their companions watched in frozen horror from their hiding places, knowing that they would soon follow their comrades into the belly of the monster. The Cyclops ate with evident relish while commenting on the superior flavor of Greek flesh compared to the usual sailors who found their way to his island. When his gruesome meal was finished, Polyphemus rolled onto his side near the blocked entrance and began to snore with sounds like distant avalanches, while his remaining prisoners huddled in the darkness, knowing that morning would bring fresh horrors. The boulder that sealed their tomb was far too heavy for mortal strength to move, and the Cyclops himself was too large and powerful to be overcome by conventional weapons. Through the long night, Odysseus' mind raced through possibilities and strategies, seeking some weakness in their seemingly hopeless situation. His men looked to him for salvation, as they had during the darkest days of the Trojan siege, but this enemy was unlike any they had faced in 10 years of warfare. Neither courage nor skill at arms would serve against a foe whose skin could turn the sharpest bronze, and whose strength made him invulnerable to normal methods of attack as dawn. Light began to filter through cracks around the entrance boulder. The Cyclops stirred from his sleep and immediately claimed 2 more victims for his morning meal. The screams of the dying men echoed through the cavern, while Polyphemus crunched their bones with evident satisfaction and remarked that he had enough food to last for several days, if he was careful to make his prisoners last. It was then that Odysseus noticed the massive olive wood club that the Cyclops had left lying near. The fire, a weapon so large that it would require 20 men to lift, but which gave him the first glimmer of hope since their capture began. The wood was seasoned and hard as iron from years of use, while one end had been roughly sharpened to a point that could penetrate even the toughest hide. His plan began to form, with the same clarity of vision that had conceived the Trojan horse, though this scheme would require even more precise timing and desperate courage. When Polyphemus prepared to leave with his flock for the day's grazing, Odysseus called out with apparent submission, "Great son of Poseidon, before you depart, would you do me the honor of tasting wine from my homeland? It is said to be the finest vintage ever produced by mortal hands, and I would consider it a privilege to share it with one whose power and wisdom clearly mark him as favored by the gods." The Cyclops paused with obvious interest, as the offer of wine penetrated his brutal but not entirely unintelligent mind. The isolation of his existence meant that luxuries like wine were unknown to him, and curiosity about this legendary beverage overcame his initial suspicion of Greek treachery. He approached the hiding place where Odysseus waited with a skin of the potent wine that had been intended as an offering to the gods. The escape from Polyphemus had cost Odysseus dearly, as 6 of his finest warriors lay dead in the Cyclops' belly, while the survivors bore wounds both physical and spiritual that would never fully heal. The blinded giant's curses still echoed across the wine-dark sea, calling upon his father Poseidon to ensure that the clever king of Ithaca would wander far from home before finding his way back to beloved Penelope and infant Telemachus. The remaining ship sailed through waters that grew stranger with each passing day, as if the very ocean itself had been altered by the earth-shaker's wrath. For weeks, they encountered nothing but empty seas and hostile winds that seemed determined to drive them ever further from their intended course. The familiar constellations that had guided Greek navigators for generations appeared in unfamiliar positions. while new stars blazed in the southern sky with colors that hurt the eyes to look upon. The water itself took on an oily quality that made their skin crawl when they had to touch it, and fish caught in these cursed regions tasted of sulfur and decay. When land finally appeared on the horizon, it rose from the sea like a vision from a fever dream. The island of Aea stretched before them, covered in forests, so dense and green that they seemed almost black in the strange light that filtered. Through clouds of unnatural purple and gold, smoke rose from somewhere deep in the interior, suggesting human habitation, while the very air above the island shimmered with heat waves that distorted vision and made distant objects appear to writhe. Like living things, the shores of this mysterious land offered several protected coves where ships could be beached safely, but Odysseus felt the same unease that had served him well during their encounter with the Lotus Eaters. Something about the island's perfect beauty seemed calculated to attract and deceive unwary travelers. The beaches were too white, the vegetation too lush, and the streams that cascaded down from the interior highlands sparkled with an almost metallic brightness that suggested they contained more than ordinary water. As his remaining ships approached the largest cove, Odysseus made the decision that would prove both wise and necessary for their survival. He ordered half his remaining men to stay with the vessels, under the command of his trusted lieutenant Eurylochus, while he personally led a scouting party of 22 warriors inland to investigate whatever dwelt in the heart of this strange island. The memory of Polyphemus' cave was still fresh in all their minds, and this time they would not allow curiosity to overcome caution. The path that led inland from the beach was paved with stones that had been fitted together with such precision that not even the thinnest blade could be inserted between them. The road wound through groves of trees whose fruit glowed with inner light and whose leaves whispered secrets in languages that predated the birth of mortal civilization. Strange flowers bloomed along the verges, releasing fragrances that seemed designed to induce both desire and forgetfulness, while birds with human faces perched in the branches and sang melodies that spoke of ancient sorceries as they climbed higher into the wooded hills. The air grew thick with magic that made their bronze weapons feel heavy as lead, while their thoughts became clouded with visions of home and family that seemed more real than their present surroundings. Several of the younger warriors began to weep openly as they saw their wives and children reaching out to them from behind the trees, while others drew their swords to fight against enemies that existed only in their enchanted minds. At the center of the island, where the path ended in a circular clearing, stood a palace that seemed to have been carved from a single enormous crystal. The walls were transparent as glass, yet stronger than bronze, while columns of pure silver supported a roof that appeared to be made from woven sunlight itself. Gardens surrounded the structure, filled with plants that no mortal botanist had ever catalogued, and fountains that sparkled with water, drawn from springs that touched the very roots of the world tree. From within the crystal palace came the sound of a woman's voice singing in harmonies that seemed to resonate in the very bones of those who heard them. The melody spoke of power beyond mortal comprehension and knowledge that stretched back to the dawn of time itself. Yet there was also something seductive and welcoming in those notes that made even the most battle-hardened veterans feel like children longing for their mothers. Embrace Odysseus signaled for his men to remain hidden while he approached the palace alone, but as he drew near the great doors, the singing stopped, and a figure emerged that made his breath catch in his throat, despite all his experience with the strange and supernatural. The woman who stood before him was tall and graceful, with skin that seemed to glow with its own inner radiance. Her hair was the color of spun gold, but with depths that suggested fire burning at its heart, and her eyes held the green of deep forest pools where ancient secrets lay hidden. She was clothed in robes that shifted color with each movement, flowing from deep purple to midnight blue to silver, like moonlight on water. A golden staff in her right hand was topped with a crystal that pulsed with power, while the fingers of her left hand were adorned with rings that contained gems of every hue. Odysseus recognized immediately that he stood in the presence of one of the immortal children of the Titans, whose mastery of sorcery made her more dangerous than any army of mortal warriors. Welcome, noble Odysseus, son of Laertes and king of Rocky. Ithaca, the enchantress spoke in a voice like honey poured over bronze. I am Circe, daughter of Helios, the sun god, and I have been expecting your arrival ever since the fates whispered of your wanderings across my father's domains, your reputation. For cleverness has traveled even to these remote shores, and I confess myself curious to test that legendary intelligence against powers that were ancient when your grandfather's grandfather was yet unborn. The fact that she knew his name and parentage confirmed Odysseus' worst fears about the supernatural nature of his hostess, but he forced himself to remain calm and diplomatic, as he had learned to do when dealing with the gods and their offspring. Great Circe, your beauty and wisdom are clearly as boundless as the stories suggest. I come before you as a suppliant seeking safe passage for my men, who have endured much hardship in their efforts to return home from the wars. We ask nothing more than fresh water and perhaps guidance toward the sea lanes that lead back to Greece. Circe laughed with genuine amusement at his careful words, and the sound was like silver bells ringing in a crystal cave. "O clever king, you speak as diplomatically as a seasoned ambassador, but your men have already approached my palace with less caution than their leader. 20 of your finest warriors even now taste the hospitality that I reserve for unexpected guests. They seemed quite eager to sample the delicacies that I prepared especially for their arrival." A chill of dread ran down Odysseus' spine as he realized that his advanced scouting party had somehow bypassed his position and entered the palace while he remained hidden in the forest. The enchantress gestured toward a side entrance, where he could see his men seated around a great table, laden with foods that steamed and sparkled with unnatural colors. Their faces wore expressions of dreamy contentment as they ate with the enthusiasm of men who had not tasted decent provisions. "In many weeks, what have you done to them, witch?" Odysseus demanded, drawing his bronze sword, though he suspected that normal weapons would prove useless against one whose power derived from divine bloodlines. "If you have harmed my companions, I swear by Zeus himself that you will pay the price despite whatever protection your immortal heritage may provide." "Harmed them," Circe repeated with mock surprise. "I have given them exactly what they desired most in all the world: freedom from the burdens of human consciousness and responsibility. They need no longer concern themselves with the complexities of leadership or the weight of making decisions that determine life and death. Instead, they may spend their remaining years in simple contentment, eating and sleeping without a care in the world." As she spoke these words, Odysseus watched in horror as his 20 companions began to change before his eyes. Their human features started to blur and shift, while coarse hair sprouted from their skin and their limbs grew shorter and more awkward. The transformation was gradual but inexorable, as the magic worked its way through their bodies, changing them from proud Greek warriors into common swine that snorted and grunted as they continued to eat from golden troughs that had replaced the elegant dining table. "Behold the true nature that lies hidden within all mortal men," Circe proclaimed with evident satisfaction at her handiwork. "Stripped of the pretensions and illusions that you call civilization, they reveal themselves as the beasts they have always been. Your noble companions now live in perfect harmony with their essential selves, and I assure you they are far happier as swine than they ever were as soldiers." The enchanted pigs that had once been his trusted warriors looked up at Odysseus with eyes that still held flickers of human intelligence and recognition, but they seemed unable to speak or even remember how to stand upright. Their grunts and squeals carried notes of pleading that broke his heart even, as they filled him with rage against the sorceress, who had wrought this hideous transformation for no crime, greater than accepting offered hospitality. "Change them back immediately," Odysseus roared, raising his sword as if he intended to strike down the daughter of a god. Despite the obvious futility of such an action, "I care nothing for your divine parentage or magical powers. These men have families waiting for them in Greece, and children who will grow up fatherless if you do not restore them to their proper forms." Circe regarded him with the amused tolerance that immortals reserved for the passionate outbursts of mortals. "And what will you offer me in exchange for such a restoration, noble king? What could a wandering mortal possibly possess that would interest one who has lived for countless centuries and commanded powers that reshape reality itself? Your threats ring hollow when directed against one whom death cannot touch, and your sword would shatter like pottery against my divine flesh. It was then that Odysseus felt a familiar presence beside him, as Hermes, the messenger god, materialized from the afternoon shadows, wearing his characteristic broad-brimmed hat and carrying the golden staff that marked his authority. As herald of the immortals, the god of thieves and travelers had always shown favor to clever mortals, and his appearance now suggested that the king of Ithaca had not been entirely abandoned by the divine powers, despite Poseidon's enmity. Greetings. Cousin, Hermes said, addressing Circe with the casual familiarity of one immortal speaking to another. I see you have acquired some new pets for your menagerie, but I fear this particular mortal has friends among the gods who would take it poorly. If he were to join your collection of transformed visitors, perhaps we might discuss terms that would satisfy your love of games while allowing him to continue his journey home. The encounter between the two divine beings crackled with power and tension as ancient relationships and obligations came into play. Odysseus found himself standing at the center of negotiations that would determine not only his own fate, but that of his transformed companions and the remaining crew members who waited with the ships, unaware that their leader faced the greatest challenge of his long journey home. The year spent on Circe's island had passed like a dream within a dream, as Odysseus and his restored companions lived in luxury that surpassed even the royal palaces of Troy, while the enchantress shared secrets of magic and wisdom that mortal men were never meant to possess. The sorceress had proven to be a generous and fascinating hostess once her games with transformation were concluded. But as the seasons turned and homesickness began to gnaw at their hearts like a physical pain, the Greeks knew that the time had come to resume their journey toward Ithaca. Circe had agreed to provide them with guidance for the next stage of their voyage, but her instructions filled even the bravest warriors with dread, as she revealed that their path home lay through the very gates of death itself. The prophet Tiresias, who alone among the dead retained the gift of true sight, must be consulted. In the realm of Hades, before they could learn how to appease Poseidon's wrath and find their way back to the world of the living. The entrance to the underworld lies beyond the Pillars of Hercules, where the river ocean encircles the world, Circe explained as she traced mystical symbols in the sand with her golden staff. You must sail until you reach the grove of Persephone, where black poplars and willows grow beside the rivers, Acheron and Cocytus. There you will find the place where the spirits of the dead can be summoned to speak with the living if the proper rituals are observed. The preparations for such a journey required both physical supplies and spiritual purification, as the crew gathered the special offerings that would be needed to gain entry to the realm of the dead. A black ram and ewe without blemish were selected from Circe's flocks, while amphora were filled with fresh blood honey and milk that would serve as libations to the powers below the enchantress. Herself prepared protective charms and spoke incantations that would shield them from the worst dangers of their passage through waters where living men were not meant to sail, as their ships departed from Aea with sails filled by winds that Circe had summoned through her magic. The sorceress stood on her crystal palace steps, watching them disappear beyond the horizon. Her final words carried clearly across the water, despite the distance. Remember, noble Odysseus, that the dead hunger for the warmth of life, and will tell you anything to taste fresh blood again. Trust only Tiresias among all the spirits you encounter, for he alone speaks truth without the corruption of desperate desire. The voyage toward the edge of the world took them through seas that grew progressively stranger and more ominous as they sailed beyond the boundaries of the familiar Mediterranean into waters that appeared on no maps drawn by mortal hands. The sun seemed to grow weaker with each passing day, while the stars at night burned with cold fires that gave no comfort to sailors accustomed to navigating by celestial guides that had served Greek mariners for generations. Strange creatures began to appear in the waters around their ships. As they approached the realm where life and death met in eternal conflict, dolphins with human faces swam alongside their vessels, while seabirds with the heads of women circled overhead, crying out warnings in languages that predated the birth of civilization itself. The very ocean took on a leaden quality that reflected no light from above, while currents pulled them steadily toward destinations that no living soul should seek. When they finally reached the grove of Persephone at the confluence of the rivers of the dead, the landscape that greeted them seemed like a vision from the nightmares of madmen. The trees were leafless and black as charcoal, while the grass beneath their feet felt brittle as old bones. The air itself was thin and cold, carrying scents of earth and decay that spoke of countless graves opened beneath starless skies. The two rivers flowed with waters that were dark as liquid night, and made no sound as they merged and separated in patterns that hurt the mind to contemplate. Following Circe's precise instructions, Odysseus selected the spot where the ritual must be performed and began the delicate process of summoning the spirits of the dead. His men formed a protective circle around him, with drawn swords, while he dug a shallow pit in the cursed earth and filled it with the sacred libations. The black ram and ewe were sacrificed with prayers to Hades and Persephone, rulers of the underworld, while their blood flowed into the pit, creating a dark pool that seemed to absorb light from the surrounding area. The effect was immediate and terrifying, as the boundaries between worlds began to thin and blur. Shadows that had no source material began to move through the grove, while whispers in voices, long silenced, echoed from every direction. The temperature dropped until their breath came out in visible clouds, while an unnatural wind stirred the black branches overhead, with sounds like the moaning of the damned. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to shift and pulse, as if something vast and alive moved in the depths below. The first spirit to appear was that of Elpenor, the youngest member of their crew, who had died on Circe's island when he fell from the palace roof in a drunken stupor. His shade looked exactly as he had in life, but translucent and somehow diminished, as if death had drained away essential qualities that made him fully real. His voice, when he spoke, carried the hollow quality of wind through empty caves, while his eyes held depths of sorrow that no living man should ever witness. "Noble Odysseus," the ghost pleaded as it hovered at the edge of the blood-filled pit, "I beg you to remember me when you return to the world of light. My body still lies unburied on Circe's shore, and my spirit cannot rest until the proper funeral rites have been performed. Please, I implore you to build my funeral pyre and raise a barrow over my bones, so that future travelers may know that a Greek warrior died far from home but was not forgotten by his comrades." The king of Ithaca promised to honor his fallen crewman's request, but his attention was quickly drawn to other spirits that began to materialize from the shadows, drawn by the scent of fresh blood like moths to a flame. The shades of warriors who had died at Troy appeared in their battle, armor but bearing the wounds that had killed them. Achilles, the mightiest of all Greek heroes, approached with the spear thrust still visible in his heel, while Patroclus, his beloved companion, showed the sword cuts that Hector had inflicted during their fatal duel. But it was the appearance of his own mother, Anticlea, that struck Odysseus like a physical blow to the chest. Her spirit looked exactly as she had when he left Ithaca 20 years before, but her face was marked with the sorrow of one who had died without seeing her son return from war. She moved toward the blood with desperate hunger, while tears that could not fall traced paths down her incorporeal cheeks. "My beloved son," she whispered, in a voice like autumn leaves rustling, in an empty courtyard. "How do you come to this place of shadows while still clothed in living flesh? I died waiting for news of your return, watching the horizon every day until my eyes could no longer bear the light, and my heart could no longer endure the weight of hope deferred. Penelope still waits for you, but suitors have come to the palace seeking to claim both your wife and your kingdom." The news of his mother's death and the threat to his family filled Odysseus with rage and despair, but he forced himself to remain focused on his mission as more spirits gathered around the pit of blood like a council of the dead. Agamemnon appeared bearing the wounds inflicted by his unfaithful wife Clytemnestra, while Ajax, the son of Telamon, turned away in shame, still angry over the judgment that had awarded Achilles' armor to Odysseus rather than himself. Finally, the spirit they had come to consult materialized from the deepest shadows as Tiresias, the blind prophet of Thebes, approached, with the staff of his office and the golden headband that marked his sacred calling. Even in death, his sightless eyes seemed to penetrate every secret, while his voice carried the authority of one who had spoken truth to kings and gods alike throughout. his long mortal life, son of Laertes. The prophet intoned as he bent to drink from the sacrificial blood, "You seek knowledge of your path home, but the road you must travel is longer and more perilous than you imagine. Poseidon's anger burns like an unquenchable fire, and he will not easily forgive the blinding of his son Polyphemus. Your ships will be wrecked and your men will perish. But if you can resist temptation and honor the gods, you will eventually reach Ithaca alone and honor foreign." Vessel. The prophecy continued with warnings about the cattle of the sun god Helios, which must not be harmed despite any hunger that might drive desperate men to slaughter the sacred beasts. Tiresias spoke of trials yet to come, including a final journey that Odysseus must make on foot, carrying an oar until he reached people who had never seen the sea and knew nothing of ships or sailing. Only when he had planted the oar in foreign soil and made proper sacrifices to Poseidon would the Earthshaker's curse finally be lifted. "But know this, king of Ithaca," the prophet warned as his spirit began to fade back into the shadows. "Your homecoming will bring not peace, but conflict. The suitors who devour your wealth and pursue your wife must be dealt with by sword and spear before you can truly reclaim your rightful place. Even then your troubles will not end for the sea. God's anger runs deep, and the price of cleverness is often higher than simple men imagine." As Tiresias disappeared back into the realm of shadows, other spirits pressed forward, desperate for their chance to taste the blood and speak. With the living Odysseus saw heroes and kings from ages past, while women who had been famous for their beauty or wisdom in life now wandered as shades seeking any connection to the world they had lost. The sight of so much accumulated sorrow and the knowledge that he too would one day join their ranks filled him with a melancholy that would haunt him for the remainder of his journey. The ritual concluded when the blood in the pit finally congealed and lost its power to sustain the spirits, who faded back into whatever existence awaited them in the halls of Hades. The living Greeks hurried back to their ships with the prophet's words burning in their minds, while behind them the grove of Persephone returned to its eternal silence, broken only by the whisper of rivers that carried the hopes and fears of the dead towards seas that no living man should sail. The journey back from the underworld had changed every man aboard the ships of Odysseus, as they carried within their hearts the weight of conversations with the dead and the terrible knowledge that their own fates hung by threads no stronger than spider silk. The prophecy of Tiresias echoed in their minds like a curse as they sailed through waters that seemed determined to test every aspect of their courage and resolve. The crew moved about their duties with the mechanical precision of men who had seen too much and understood that their ordeal was far from over. Circe had been waiting for their return to her crystal palace, as if she could sense their approach across the vast distances of the wine-dark sea. Her immortal beauty seemed even more radiant than before, but her eyes held depths of sympathy that spoke of genuine concern for mortals who had ventured where no living souls belonged. She welcomed them back with a feast that restored both their physical strength and something of their battered spirits, while she listened with rapt attention to their account of the underworld journey. "You have done something that few mortals have attempted, and even fewer have survived," the enchantress said as they gathered around her table laden with foods that seemed to glow with their own inner light. "But your trials are far from ended, and the path ahead contains dangers that will test not only your courage, but your very essence as human beings. The prophecy you received must be heeded in every detail if you hope to see the shores of Ithaca again." As dawn broke over the mystical island, Circe led Odysseus to the highest tower of her palace, where she could point across the seemingly endless expanse of ocean toward the hazards that awaited his departure. Her golden staff traced patterns in the air that became visible maps, showing currents and winds that mortal navigators could never detect, while her voice took on the otherworldly quality that marked her as daughter of the sun god himself. "First you will encounter the sirens, whose voices carry power beyond mortal comprehension," she explained, as ghostly images appeared in the crystalline air around them. "They appear as beautiful women seated on a flowering meadow, but their island is white with the bones of sailors who heard their song and willingly steered their ships onto the rocks that surround their domain. No mortal man has ever heard their voices and retained the strength to sail away for their music, speaks directly to the deepest desires of the human heart. The enchantress described the nature of the siren's supernatural song, which promised knowledge of all things past, present, and future. To those who would only come close enough to hear their words clearly, they sang of glory that would make a man immortal in the memory of future generations, and of secrets that could grant power beyond the dreams of kings. Their voices wove spells that made listeners forget everything else, including wives and children waiting at home until nothing remained. But the desperate need to reach the source of that divine music. But there is a way to pass them safely, if you have the courage to endure temptation beyond anything you have yet faced, Circe continued, as her magical images showed the treacherous strait where the sirens dwelt. Stop the ears of all your men with soft beeswax so that they cannot hear the fatal song, but if you yourself would hear their voices and live to tell of it, you must be bound to the mast of your ship with ropes so strong that even your enhanced strength cannot break them free. She warned that the song would make him beg and command his men to release him with arguments so persuasive that they would seem perfectly reasonable, even to those who knew the danger. No matter what promises he made or threats he uttered, his crew must keep rowing and refuse to untie his bonds until they had passed beyond the range of the sirens' voices. The test would reveal whether his legendary self-control could withstand the ultimate temptation of forbidden knowledge. Beyond the sirens lies an even deadlier passage, the sorceress continued, as her aerial maps shifted to show a narrow strait flanked by towering cliffs. On one side dwells Scylla, the six-headed monster, whose necks are long as shipmasts and whose teeth can bite through bronze as easily as a man chews bread. She was once a beautiful nymph, but jealousy and magic transformed her into something that hungers constantly for human flesh, the magical. Images showed the horrible reality of Scylla, as she had become with her lower body rooted in the living rock of her cliff, while her 6 heads swayed like serpents watching for ships that ventured too close to her domain. Each mouth contained rows of razor-sharp fangs, while her necks could stretch down to snatch sailors from their decks faster than the eye could follow. She had fed on passing vessels for countless generations until the bones of her victims formed white beaches at the base of her cliff. On the opposite side of the strait lurks Charybdis, the whirlpool that swallows entire ships 3 times each day and spews them forth again in fragments too small to identify, Circe explained, as the images showed a maelstrom that seemed to reach down to the very roots of the ocean. She was once a daughter of Poseidon, but Zeus punished her greed by transforming her into a living vortex that devours everything that comes within her reach. The enchantress made clear that navigating between these twin dangers required a choice that no captain should ever have to make. Steering close to Charybdis meant risking the destruction of all his ships and the death of every man under his command while sailing near Scylla, guaranteed the loss of 6 warriors, but left the remainder with a chance of survival. The mathematics of leadership demanded that he sacrifice the few to save the many, but such calculations came with a cost to the soul that no amount of strategic thinking could fully prepare him to bear. Armed with this terrible knowledge and supplies that Circe had blessed with protective enchantments, the Greeks departed from Aea for what they all hoped would be the final stage of their journey home. The sorceress stood on her crystal steps as they sailed away, and her voice carried clearly across the water, with final words of counsel. Remember that wisdom sometimes lies in accepting losses rather than risking everything for perfect victory. The dead cannot be brought back to life, but the living can still be saved if you choose carefully. The approach to the Sirens' Island began hours before the supernatural voices could be heard, as the very air seemed to thicken with anticipation, and the crew began to display signs of unease that had nothing to do with normal fears of storm or enemy attack. The seabirds that usually followed their ships turned back as if they sensed dangers ahead, while dolphins and other sea creatures disappeared entirely, leaving them alone on waters that reflected the sky like polished bronze. Odysseus gathered his men and explained the nature of the trial that awaited them, speaking with the calm authority of a commander who had led them through 10 years of warfare and countless supernatural perils. His instructions were precise and left no room for individual interpretation. Every man must seal his ears with the soft beeswax that Circe had provided and continue rowing no matter what. They might see or think they heard, I will be bound to the mast so that I may hear their song and learn what knowledge they offer. But you must ignore every word I speak from the moment we enter their domain until we have passed beyond their power." He commanded as his most trusted warriors began preparing the ropes that would hold him fast. "If I beg you to release me, you must tighten the bonds. If I promise you rewards or threaten you with punishment, you must remember that those are not my true words, but the influence of their magic speaking through me." As the island of the Sirens appeared on the horizon like a jewel of impossible beauty set in azure waters, the crew completed their preparations with the methodical efficiency of veterans who had learned to follow orders without question. The beeswax was pressed firmly into every ear, while Odysseus took his position against the mast and allowed himself to be secured with bonds that would have held a wild bull. The rowers took their positions and began the steady rhythm that would carry them past temptation toward whatever trials still awaited. The song began as a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on breezes that smelled of flowers, blooming in eternal spring. At first the melody was wordless but hauntingly beautiful, like the lullabies that mothers sang to children in the peaceful kingdoms they had left behind. But as their ship drew closer to the island, the voices became clearer, and Odysseus could distinguish individual words that spoke directly to his deepest longings and most secret desires. "Come here, renowned Odysseus, great glory of the Greeks, and listen to our voice," the sirens sang in harmonies that seemed to resonate in his very bones. "No man has ever passed our island in his black ship without stopping to hear the sweet music that flows from our lips, and he who listens goes away delighted and wiser than before. We know everything that happened on the broad plain of Troy, and everything that will happen hereafter on the fertile earth." The song promised him knowledge that would make him the wisest man who ever lived, and glory that would ensure his name was remembered until the end of time. They sang of secrets that could prevent the death of his remaining companions, and wisdom that would allow him to reclaim his kingdom without bloodshed. The voices painted pictures of reunion with Penelope that would be sweeter than any mortal love, and of watching his son Telemachus grow to manhood under his guidance and protection. Every word was calculated to strike at the heart of his deepest needs and most desperate hopes, while the music itself seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to the primitive parts of his brain that controlled desire and longing. He found himself straining against his bonds with strength he had never possessed before, while his voice rose in commands and pleas that would have moved stones to pity as he begged his crew to release him from the ropes that kept him from the source of such divine wisdom. But his men had stopped their ears as instructed, and could hear nothing of either the sirens' song or their captain's desperate appeals. They rowed with mechanical precision while their eyes remained fixed on their oars, as they had been trained to do. The ship cut through the calm waters at maximum speed, carrying them past the flowering island, where beautiful forms could be glimpsed, moving through meadows that were indeed white with the bones of previous visitors who had succumbed to temptation. The song followed them for what seemed like hours, growing ever more desperate and enticing as the sirens realized that these mortals might actually escape their snare. They promised Odysseus everything he had ever desired and many things he had never dared to dream of. But the beeswax held firm and the ropes remained tight until finally the voices faded into the distance and he collapsed against his bonds with the exhaustion of a man who had wrestled with gods as his crew removed the wax from their ears and untied the ropes that had saved them all from destruction. Odysseus found that he could barely speak from the strain of resisting the most powerful temptation any mortal had ever faced. The knowledge that he had heard the siren's song and lived to tell of it would be a source of pride for the remainder of his life, but it came paired with the haunting memory of wisdom that had been offered and forever lost. The celebration of their victory over the sirens was brief, as Odysseus remembered Circe's warnings about the even deadlier passage that lay ahead. The cliffs of Scylla and Charybdis were already visible on the horizon, and he knew that the most terrible choice of his long journey was about to be forced upon him. 20 years had passed since Odysseus first sailed from his beloved island kingdom, and now he stood alone on the deck of a Phaeacian ship, watching the familiar coastline of Ithaca emerge from the morning mist, like the vision conjured from his deepest dreams. The magical vessel that carried him homeward, moved without mortal crew, guided by the divine blessing of King Alcinous, whose people possessed the favor of Poseidon himself, after losing all his ships and Aiki. Companions to the six-headed monster Scylla, and the final disaster on the island of the sun god Helios. This foreign craft represented his last hope of seeing home again. The years of wandering had transformed the young king who had departed with such high hopes into something far more dangerous and cunning than the warrior who had helped devise the fall of Troy. His face bore scars from battles with monsters and gods, while his eyes held depths of knowledge that came only from witnessing horrors beyond mortal comprehension. His hair had turned completely silver, and his powerful frame carried the weariness of one who had endured trials that would have broken lesser men. His clothing was that of a beggar rather than a king as befitted, one who had lost everything except his life and his burning desire for revenge. As the Phaeacian ship ran silently up onto the beach of his homeland, Odysseus felt tears streaming down his weathered cheeks for the first time since he had watched his last companion die in the waters off Sicily. The familiar scent of wild thyme and olive groves filled his nostrils, while the cry of seabirds overhead sounded like music after so many years of hearing only the voices of monsters and the lamentations of the dead. He knelt on the sand that had known his footsteps as a child and pressed his face against the earth that had given birth to his ancestors, but his joy was tempered by the knowledge that his trials were far from over, as the goddess Athena materialized beside him in the form of a young shepherd carrying a staff carved from olive wood. Her grey eyes sparkled with divine wisdom, while her voice carried the affection of one who had watched over him throughout his long ordeal, even when other gods had turned their faces away. "Welcome home, noble son of Laertes," the goddess said, as she transformed into her true appearance, radiating power that made the very air shimmer with golden light. "Your wanderings are ended, but your greatest test still lies before you. The suitors who have devoured your wealth and pursued your faithful wife must be dealt with before you can truly reclaim what was stolen during your absence." She explained that more than 100 young nobles from Ithaca and the surrounding islands had taken up residence in his palace, consuming his livestock and stores while competing for the hand of Penelope in marriage. His faithful wife had resisted their advances for years through a combination of clever delays and outright defiance, but her options were running out as pressure mounted from families who saw an opportunity to claim the throne of Ithaca through forced matrimony. "Your son Telemachus has grown into a fine young man, worthy of his father's blood," Athena continued as she began weaving enchantments around Odysseus that would disguise his true appearance. "He searches for you, even now sailing to distant lands in hope of learning news of your fate. But he faces dangers from those who would kill him to prevent any challenge to their claims upon your kingdom. The time for subtlety has passed, and only blood will restore justice to your household." The goddess transformed his appearance with divine magic, aging his face and bending his strong frame until he appeared to be nothing more than an ancient beggar who had wandered to Ithaca seeking charity. His fine clothing became tattered rags, while his silver hair turned white and thin. His hands grew gnarled and spotted with age, while his voice took on the quavering tones of extreme old age. Yet beneath this disguise, his strength remained undiminished, and his mind burned with plans for vengeance. Thus disguised, Odysseus made his way through countryside that was achingly familiar yet subtly changed by the passage of 2 decades. The olive groves had grown thicker and more productive, while new farmhouses dotted hillsides that had been empty when he departed for Troy. But there were also signs of neglect and decline, as fields lay fallow for want of proper supervision, and herds had dwindled without the strong leadership that had once made Ithaca prosperous. His first stop was the humble dwelling of Eumaeus the swineherd, who had been his loyal servant since childhood. The good man welcomed the apparent beggar with the hospitality that marked him as truly noble, despite his humble station offering food and shelter without question, while speaking of his lost master with tears streaming down his weathered face. The reunion, when Odysseus revealed his true identity, was joyful beyond description, as the faithful servant fell to his knees in wonder and gratitude. From Eumaeus he learned the full extent of the disaster that had befallen his household. In his absence, the suitors had grown increasingly bold in their demands, while their behavior had degenerated from mere rudeness to outright threats of violence. Penelope was being pressured to choose a husband from among them, while his aged father Laertes had withdrawn to a small farm outside the city where he lived, like a hermit, mourning the son he believed dead. The palace that had once been filled with loyal retainers and the laughter of children now echoed with the drunken revelry of young men who treated his home like a tavern, while his servants were forced to watch helplessly as 20 years of careful accumulation were consumed in wasteful feasting. The great hall where he had presided over festivals and dispensed justice now rang with the crude jokes and boastful tales of those who had never earned their place through service or achievement. It was in this guise of an aged beggar that Odysseus first entered his own palace and saw with his own eyes the extent of the degradation that had occurred during his absence. The suitors sprawled on couches that had been crafted by master artisans while they gnawed on joints of beef from his own herds and spilled wine from his private stores onto floors that had once gleamed with careful polishing. They treated the servants with casual cruelty and spoke of Penelope as if she were already their property to be divided among the winners of whatever contests they might devise. But it was the sight of his faithful wife that nearly broke his carefully maintained disguise as Penelope appeared in the great hall, looking like a queen, despite her obvious sorrow. Her beauty had ripened rather than faded with the passing years, while her bearing retained all the dignity that had first captured his heart when they were both young, and the world seemed full of promise. She wore robes of deep purple that marked her royal station, but her eyes held the weariness of one who had fought too many battles against impossible odds. She moved among the suitors with careful politeness that barely concealed her disgust, while they competed with increasingly outrageous displays of wealth and supposed heroic deeds in their efforts to win her hand. The irony of their situation was not lost on Odysseus, as he realized that these young men were attempting to claim the bed of a woman whose husband had proven himself the greatest strategist and warrior of his generation. Through trials they could never imagine, that evening as the suitors finally departed to their own homes, leaving the palace in ruins that would require hours to clean, Penelope descended to the great hall, where the disguised beggar sat by the dying fire. Her movements were graceful as ever, but her face showed the strain of years spent walking a tightrope between hope and despair, as she clung to the possibility that her husband might still live. "Despite all evidence to the contrary, old man," she said in a voice that still carried the musical quality that had enchanted him 20 years before. "You have the look of one who has traveled far and seen much. I would hear news of the wider world. If you have any to share, these walls have become my prison, and I hunger for word of lands beyond this island, where men still remember honor and loyalty." The conversation that followed tested every aspect of Odysseus' self-control as he sat within, arm's reach of the woman he loved above all else in the world, while maintaining the pretense of being a stranger. Her questions about her missing husband were carefully phrased, but carried undertones of desperate hope that cut through his heart. Like bronze daggers, he found himself describing Odysseus as if speaking of another man, while she listened with an intensity that suggested she was analyzing every word for hidden meanings when she mentioned the great contest that she planned to hold, where the suitors would compete to string her husband's mighty bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads. Odysseus felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the opportunity that fate had placed before him. No man alive save himself possessed the strength to draw that particular weapon, while the test of accuracy would eliminate any pretender who might somehow manage the first task. The final recognition came not through any grand revelation, but through a simple test that proved more effective than any dramatic gesture. When Penelope spoke of moving their marriage bed to accommodate a guest, Odysseus could not restrain himself from explaining that the bed could not be moved because it had been carved from a living olive tree, whose roots still anchored it to the earth. Only the true Odysseus could have known such an intimate detail, and his words shattered her carefully maintained composure like a stone through glass. The reunion that followed was worth every moment of suffering endured during 20 years of wandering, as husband and wife fell into each other's arms with passion undiminished by the passage of time. Her tears of joy mingled with his as they spoke simultaneously of love that had survived every trial and separation. The bedroom that had seemed like a distant dream for so many years became reality once again, as they rediscovered the physical expression of a bond that had never truly been broken. But even in the midst of his happiness, Odysseus knew that one final trial remained, as the suitors would return with the dawn expecting to resume their siege of his household. The great bow waited in its special chamber, while the axes stood ready to test the skill of any who would claim the right to rule Ithaca in his place. The contest would provide the perfect opportunity for revenge, while the sacred laws of hospitality would justify whatever violence might prove necessary to cleanse his home, as Penelope slept peacefully beside him. For the first time in 20 years, Odysseus lay awake, planning the strategy that would end his long ordeal and restore justice to his kingdom. The beggar's disguise had served its purpose, but tomorrow would reveal the true king of Ithaca in all his terrible glory, as he reclaimed what had been stolen and punished those who had dared to violate the most sacred bonds of Greek civilization.